Good evening, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. I am very honored to be moderating this conversation on Devaki Jain's wonderful memoirs. Thank you, India International Center and Speaking Tiger, for organizing this. I'm calling it a conversation because that is what this will be rather than the usual panel discussion. In fact, the very nature of Devaki's book lends itself to a wide-ranging conversation because of the vast territory that she covers in the book in many different ways. But first, let me get introductions out of the way. Actually, I don't need to introduce either Devaki or Romila Thapar or Antara Dev Sen, but as that is a formality, let me do it anyway. Devaki Jain graduated in economics and philosophy from St. Anne's College, Oxford. She's now an honorary fellow of the college. From 63 to 69, she was a lecturer in economics in Miranda House, Delhi University. She moved on from teaching to full-time research and publication as the director of the Institute of Social Studies Trust. Over the course of her career, Devaki Jain founded a wide range of institutions, such as the Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era, DAWN, a third world network of women social scientists, and the Institute of Social Studies Trust, a research center in Delhi. She's a recipient of the Padma Bhushan and an honorary doctorate from the University of Westville, Durban, South Africa. Dr. Romila Thapar, again, I don't need to introduce, but she's an eminent historian. All of us have grown up reading her. She's Emerita Professor of History at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and much, much more. Antara Dev Sen is a literary critic, writer, and founder-editor of The Little Magazine. And my name is Kalpana Sharma. I'm a journalist. Before we move into the conversation, may I request Devaki, Romila, and Antara to please hold up a copy of Devaki's book so that we can officially launch it. Unfortunately, the distance between Delhi and Mumbai seems to have grown, and my copy has not yet arrived, so I have not seen it except the soft copy. So can we hold up and say that the book has been launched? Devaki, Romila, here we are, the Brass Notebook, published by Speaking Tiger. Devaki Jain's wonderful memoirs is hereby launched, and I hope all of you who are listening in will quickly go and get a copy of it. So this afternoon, we are really fortunate to have Devaki and Romila Thapar together. You are both women who I've admired, not just because of your impressive scholarship, but also because as public intellectuals, you have not hesitated to take a strong stand on a range of issues, thereby speaking truth to power, something that we in the media are supposed to do, but fall well short of it most of the time. Often our window into the world of people like Devaki and Romila is through their writings and their scholarly work, but rarely do we get a chance to know them apart from this. So for me, what is special about Devaki's memoirs are that they open a window into her life, her childhood, her growing up, her many adventures, her marriage, and also her important engagements on many significant and relevant concerns in India and internationally. The book is rich in anecdotes and is very racily written, if I may say so. And it stands out about all, for me at least, as somebody who read it, for its honesty. But without giving away too much, and before we begin this conversation, let me read just this one quote from the book that illustrates best what Devaki was as she grew up and is today, at least to me. Here's the quote. On reflection, I think I was born free. I did not only yearn for freedom, but seized it at every chance I got, whatever the grown-ups said. I climbed the tallest trees, went horse riding, did not spend my time merely envying my brothers their bicycles, but riding them. I did these things disregarding the conventions that try to dictate how girls should behave. So when I read that, I thought, this is it. So then let's begin what I hope will be a stimulating and fun-filled afternoon. Just a housekeeping thing. If people have questions, there's a chat box where you can post your questions. And at the end of our conversation, I'll try and make sure we keep at least 10 minutes aside so we can address those questions. So, Devaki, let's start at the beginning, as they say. What made you write your memoirs? As a before midnight child, so to speak, you grew up in an India that few today can even visualize. Perhaps you and Romila could share what the 1960s meant to both of you and how much of that mood shaped what you are today. So, Devaki, you first.
Thank you so much, Kalpana. Do you mind if I just spend 2 minutes
No, of course.
remembering people who made this journey possible for me? I just feel I must acknowledge because there was no idea in my heart and mind to write this kind of biography. I never thought it was worthwhile to tell my story, never having reached any kind of heights in any way. But there is a wonderful man called Darren Walker. He's now the president of Ford Foundation. He's a black, he's extraordinarily energetic. He just caught at me and said, "You're going to write your book." I said, "No, I have no book to write." But before I could move, he sent a huge grant to his office in Delhi and it had to be spent. I mean, it's so trivial what I'm saying, and yet it's so stupendous that I certainly wouldn't have gone on this journey of writing a book on my life if this man hadn't committed himself to a grant on his own, from his own funds, not even Ford funds. Then started the journey. And I can tell those of you who plan to write your memoirs, don't do it. It's the most absurd, idiotic thing to do because you don't want to show off. Your childhood is just like anybody else's. And then you talk of family skirmishes, everybody has written about it. So I was pushed into it because I had to spend the money. So I did spend the money. And here's the book. But there have been many people on the journey. So apart from Darren, I must thank my two nurturers. One is L.K. Bome, who is the professor of literature in Oxford, and Nakul Krishna, a young reader in English, who actually nudged me on and nudged me on. And finally, of course, Speaking Tiger, Ravi and Renuka made it happen. Along the way, I had many people who helped me, but I don't want to take your time in talking about that. So let me first start by saying, and I thank IIC. Tete has been a friend for decades. And when she welcomed it, I was really grateful. So thanks to each of you. And I hope those of you who supported me will find it worthwhile.
Could you address the question I asked about what made you, apart from this funding, I mean, what was it like, which you describe in the book, growing up in the 1960s?
You're right, that I didn't want to, I never thought I should. Because I didn't see that story in me, you know what I mean? So that I answered your question by saying that money was put on my back like a horse and I ran. But as I ran, it was very difficult to know what to share. Because sometimes if you share your achievement, that looks gross. So I followed a very traditional route, which I thought I would never follow when I read other biographies. That is where I was born, who's my family, where I went to college. These I'd seen in biographies, other autobiographies, and I never wanted to do that. But I found myself doing that because I couldn't find another way. So that's what made me write it. But then on the journey, it is true that I did feel there were certain experiences of mine that needed to be shared with the younger generation. So you asked that question also. But this feeling of suffocation that young children, young girls are feeling about sexual liberty, freedom, was something that I felt I should open the box. Here I was, a comfortable looking old lady with the diamonds on her nose, looking as if as traditional as somebody in a village in India. And she has had many affairs. She has had, what shall I say, loved her husband, made love to her husband before marriage, had miscarriages, has done everything that's supposed to be a free person. So in a way, I was trying to share with the younger generation, don't be frightened, do it, because there's nothing that should stop you. So that's one of the parts of the book that I am partly embarrassed with, but partly happy also.
So actually, you've preempted the second question that I had, which was in fact to do with this thing about, I mean, that is what stands out in the book, is that you have written, so honestly about these personal things. But let me ask Romila to come in here, because the period that you grew up in, and Romila also, in this pre-independence and post-independence, was a very special time, which I think many of us can't even visualize. And how much of that do you feel, for both of you actually, has contributed to who you are today? How much of the actual period that you grew up in? So Romila, it'd be very nice to hear from you about.
But I was very interested to read Devaki's book, partly because she's been a close friend, and so one wants to know how she approached the whole question of writing about her life. Partly also, I think, because if one sets out to write a memoir, and I haven't written a memoir, but have considered, I think there are two streams that are very important, and they come through very strongly in Devaki's book. One is self-reflection. What kind of a life have I had? What kind of a person am I? It's all these questions, conversations that one has with oneself as one's growing up. As life changes, you have an immense dialogue with yourself, trying to understand the changes and trying to understand which way to go and what to do and how to handle what is going on. All of this, in a sense, is not literally written about in a memoir, but is reflected when, after years, you sit together and say, these are the thoughts I had, and this is how I handled whatever it is that I was doing. The second stream, which I think is very important, is to recognize the fact that we're all living in a certain ambiance, in a certain time. And as Devaki says, we were children that were born just before Midnight's Children. I like to call it children that were born that lived on the cusp of independence. I think that the question there is, did the environment, did the goings on in the background in any way shape and mold our views? Now, both Devaki and I was very struck by this in Devaki's book, we like to think of ourselves as women who stood free. We broke away. Yes, I mean, our father said you can go riding and you can go swimming, you can even go abroad and study, and nobody objected. But my God, when it came to marriage, the whole patriarchal machinery was brought into force. Now, what is it that makes us, people like her and myself, and many others like us today, what is it that makes us feel somehow confident about the fact that we are free persons, that we are women who are taking our decisions? And I thought a lot about this, and I wondered, I mean, is it that we went to school, we went to convent schools, where in a sense we were the odd person out because we were not of Christian families and so on. Nevertheless, we imbibed certain attitudes and ideas, perhaps from schooling. Or was it the time we were born in? Let's not forget that we were both teenagers at the time of the peak period of the national movement. I remember going to prayer meetings held by Mahatma Gandhi in Pune, because I was in school in Pune, and after school we'd rush to Dr. Mehta's Nature Cure Clinic, where these meetings were held, and listen to him talking. And I remember at the end of the meetings, what were the slogans that used to be shouted, and not just at the meetings, but everywhere? Inqilab Zindabad, Leke Rahenge Azadi. Azadi was absolutely the slogan. And I've often wondered whether subconsciously one imbibed this and one started sort of saying, well, if it's politically azadi, then it's got to be azadi for us as well. We have to think about, what do we mean by this freedom? How do we define it? How do we define it in our lives, in our activities, in our behaviors, in our attitudes? And I think, therefore, that it is very important that people of our generation should be writing about that ambience and trying to suggest how the background of a period does influence the way in which one thinks and one acts. We're not divorced from our background, no matter, however we may be Freudian, we may be followers of James Joyce's Ulysses and so on, but that background is there, and I think that comes through very nicely in Devaki's book. I mean, I don't know, how does Antara feel about this? Do you think that your background has played a very important part in the way in which you would sit and write a memoir?
Yes, Romila, I do agree. Yeah, we can't be divorced from our background, but it also fills me with dread because the kind of times that we are passing through now. What kind of people would we become? What kind of people would our children become? What kind of people are they? That's if the spirit of freedom made you and Devaki the kind of wonderful women that you are, free women, what kind of women will our children be in the current situation? So it worries me, and I rather not think about it too much. It's a fact. But what I really enjoyed about Devaki's book was how all of this, all of what you said, Romila, came through, about Gandhi, about Vinoba Bhave, about JP, all of that was there. At the same time, the very personal Devaki was also there. She was talking about herself, she was talking about her feelings, and the intellectual world that she was in, that was also very much present. So you grow you grow in the soil of the present, and you're watered by the ideas that are around you. But then you reach for the sky, whatever sky you have as a plant does. So I'm very grateful that Devaki actually has written all of that, because it's a reminder to us and our children as to what we have had before, what the women of India have had before, and what we can be again. We seem to have completely forgotten all of that. The Sanatan India is not what we are. That's something that we need to remember. So,
Yeah.
Kalpana,
Yes, please, Devaki. Yes.
I don't think, Pico, that is a fair remark on your generation and what's happening. I mean, I'm so thrilled with Shaheen Bagh. I'm so thrilled with any
very
event
true.
of injustice, rape in UP, something else in Tamil Nadu. These young women, like younger than you, maybe your age, are out on the streets, from not only from colleges, from professional offices, even getting arrested and imprisoned. I think the spirit is actually even more public and political now, uh, though we were lucky enough to be on the cusp of that kind of political fever in the environment. But these young women, and what is so exciting is it's more women than men, more young women than men who are out on the streets. It's not when the men come, it's only political party people. When the women come, it's themselves. I think you're not being fair to your generation. So I think there's a lot there.
Maybe. I
So that
hope you're right. I
you
hope
didn't
you're
have
right.
the umbrella, the kind of wonderful atmosphere that Romila and I experienced. Between the 60s and the 90s, India was a fun place. There was when Lal Bahadur Shastri, invited all of us without security. There was no security guards at any place. So that was such a brilliant moment for us to be alive and young and working, free. So don't you think, Romila, that was a very nice period, 60s to 70s?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I look back on the 60s now, particularly, where we were all floundering in a way, because what were the questions that were being asked? What kind of society do we want to build? Which way is Indian society going? And there were endless discussions about which way is society going? Is this what we want? Is that what we want? And so on and so forth. Very intense discussions, which somehow one doesn't feel the intensity these days, but that may be simply that, someone like me is now way out and can't feel what younger people are feeling. But I think that the 60s and the 70s were very special in that sense. The other thing that one misses enormously is the human content of the questions we were asking. Society was not measured in GDP terms. Society was not measured in terms of numbers. Society was measured in terms of human achievements. Ethics was terribly important. What is it when you analyze somebody's activity, you have to bring in the ethical. You cannot leave it out. You cannot simply say the bare skeleton of what happened and leave it at that. Now, these are the kinds of background issues that one took for granted in that period, and one assumed that if one was projecting a picture of what was to come, these issues would be absolutely central. But in today's world, one seems to miss out, at least in the public pronouncements that are made. I agree with Devaki that one is that I'm, like many others, very, very deeply impressed by the kinds of positions and activities that women have taken in the last decade and so on. Nevertheless, there is, let me say that there is a kind of change in the middle class, which is really seems, at least, not to be all that concerned with building a good society, building a society of social equality, building a society where these values and ethics are prominent. One feels today there's a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of, take it as it comes and make the best of it. And if a few people are suppressed, oppressed, thrown aside, it doesn't really matter. Because what matters is that we have to get ahead, whatever getting ahead actually means. Now, as I say, I may be completely wrong. I may be not in touch with what's going on. That is the impression one has. And it's a big contrast to the way in which we acted, behaved, taught, discussed, debated, dissented, agreed in the 60s and 70s. It was a much more vital society.
Yeah, I think you're. I mean, I don't think any of us can dispute that. I think the one thing which, in a way, Devaki has been central to, and we are known. She's known as, is for her feminism. That she's known as a feminist, and I think that is a thread that has certainly carried forward till today. Though the women who think of themselves as feminists today may have arrived at it differently, and maybe their take on it is different from people like yourselves and Devaki and your generation. So that is the next. I wanted to segue into that because in the book, Devaki, you say that your journey into feminism was through the Gloria portal. So maybe you can tell us a little about that because you start off very early talking about yourself being a free woman. Which is what I think all feminists consider themselves, and yet some kind of formal acknowledgement, perhaps, of feminism came through your friendship with Gloria Steinem, which is still very much there. And you say later that as part of your research, the women that you spoke to who were from a completely different class, and but through them, you say you actually learned understood what feminism is and is meant to be. So it'd be interesting for us to know a little about that journey of yours into feminism, and what is this Gloria portal, and what is this Gloria portal that you write about?
Gloria portal is that I had not heard the word before, and I don't want to make a very long story, But Gloria and I were in Delhi together before she became a feminist. She was in Miranda House as a Rotary Fellow or Rhodes Fellow. And I was working with Lakshmi Jain in the cooperatives. We became friends, and then when I had an invitation to go to America, I then found that she was there on the Ms. Magazine cover. And I said, my God, this is my Gloria Steinem on the Ms. Magazine cover. I mean, with Ms. on the Time Magazine cover. So I hunted her out in America, and she was so thrilled to meet me after so many, almost 12, 15 years, and took me out to eat. And I can tell you that scene is so hilarious. In those days, Gloria used to wear a cowboy hat and cowboy shoes and leather tops with all those leather bits coming out like you see with the Hollywood movies. And she marched in with those boots into a cafe to meet me, and everybody was looking at her, and I was thinking, my God. Anyway, then she explained feminism to me. And I was so thrilled that it's an affirmation of yourself. It's not what is being interpreted all the time as some kind of women excluding themselves and it's anti-men. All that is rubbish. And then she explained how they went around and enabled groups of women to sit together, identify a common problem, and then articulate it and fight for it, like buses going to the right stop for school children to enter the bus. It was very practical. It was mobilizing women to claim what they want and also to articulate what was helpful to them. So I came back fully excited about the idea. And I must end with a little story which will amuse people. I came back and I said, this is very good. And you know, Aruna Asaf Ali and all those early political leaders were alive at that time. That was one of the exciting aspects of the 1970s. Aruna Asaf Ali, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, they were all in charge of major All India women's organizations. So Aruna just pitched at me and she said she's got an American idea and it's an anti-men. Even Kamala Devi said it's anti-men. Then I took some time with each of them to explain to them that it's empowering ourselves with collective consciousness. And gradually the word began to melt down in terms of their perception. So in a way, that's why I feel that now everybody, including economists who are women, politicians who are women, call themselves feminists. And I think they've taken that broader, right, that they identify themselves with women, but it's an ideology for justice and equality, and not what was earlier interpreted as an anti-men ideology. So I like to call that. But nowadays, I feel that everybody's using the word I'm a feminist. So I've written a criticism of that, saying, no, feminism is not about that. It's about justice. It goes broader than women. It's a philosophy to claim your rights. Otherwise, it becomes right now very trashed out word, in my opinion.
So Romila and Antara, would you agree with this definition?
Some ideas on that.
Antara, you go ahead first this time.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm glad that Devaki, you said that because I come across women even now who say I'm not a feminist, but but I want all the things that feminists demand and have made easy for us. So there are a lot of people who still look at feminism as not just anti-man but anti tradition, that's not something that sits comfortably with some of us even now. But yeah, I think we have had the advantage of all of you doing what you've done and living the kind of lives that you've lived. And feminism for us is easier. Men can call themselves feminists as well, which was not the case earlier. So yeah, that's basically. I mean, there's a lot to say about it, but especially because in your book, it's just amazing how you see you looking at the women in your lives, the girls in your life, whether it's being with your sister when she comes of age and the kind of treatment and embarrassment she goes through because it has to be a public thing. Your grandmother with her wealth of songs in Kannada and Tamil, knowledge of Sanskrit texts, your mother with her quiet confidence, and your mother-in-law, Chameli Devi, who looked like a traditional Haveli housewife, but who was this enormously spirited freedom fighter. Um, then, of course, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. I mean, all these women that you talk about before you even go to um, Gloria and the Western concept of feminism, there is a feminist consciousness slowly taking shape in you, which you, being very self-critical, say that you didn't really have, because you say that even in Miranda House when you were teaching, you didn't enjoy being with women who were talking about their roles as a mother or the problems they had. You much rather you really enjoyed the intellectual discussions with the men. So you're very self-critical, extremely honest, very self-critical, but at the same time, it's very interesting to see how this feminism, the idea of feminism develops in you. And just one thing I wanted to bring in is when you say that Gloria, feminism through the Gloria portal, yes, perhaps. But uh, I thought reading the book that you first started thinking about feminism when you wrote that piece in seminar, um, goaded by Romila, on the Panchakanya and how they were all in our tradition, how the ideal women in our tradition were not very free women. So I thought, in my mind, I mean, of course, it's a text, it's out there in the public domain, so each of us will take away what we want from it. So in my mind, it's that which is the you're stepping into the feminism, and the world of feminism is that point. So
Role to play in that. I think you ask her.
Romila, yeah, we're waiting for you to.
You got me into this. You better tell them how.
Yes, well, I'm delighted that I got her trapped into feminism early. No, I was very struck by a nice sentence in the memoirs where Devaki talks about having two husbands would be quite a boon. And I thought to myself, how right she is. But at the same time, did Draupadi think it was a boon? She had 5 of them, not just 2, not 1. But no, more seriously, the point is that, yes, there is a tradition. And I'm glad to say that even though I have not written on pre-modern history from what is called a feminist point of view, but many younger historians have talked about the fact that there are issues and ideas that come through in the delineation of women characters in our epics and in our literature, even religious literature, even the way the goddesses are constructed and the roles they play, which need to be looked at very closely, not just in the usual way of these are subordinate characters, but as people who are making a stand in society, who are saying something different from the way in which we have constructed them. So I think that there's a, a lot there that needs analysis. But I also thought that one of the interesting aspects of the discussion on feminism was really when, Devaki, when you talk about the fact that you were struck by the impoverishment of women and the malnutrition of women, being very suggestive, to use the mildest and politest word, of the status of women in society. And that this, in a sense, got you thinking about other issues. quite apart from my goading you into writing of that article for seminar. But for example, when you decided that you would undertake this work of why it is that women were impoverished, and why is it that one assumes that women will continue to be malnourished, as in fact they continue to be to this day. I think that kind of investigation was extremely important to your understanding of the role and status and activities of women in Indian society, which was as important as the Gloria portal, as it were. But I think that at the same time, what is different, perhaps some of us at least. All right, I didn't pitch myself into feminism. I find myself being much more of a feminist now as I grow older, and when I'm called upon to comment on traditional literature and so on, I find that this is surfacing much more than it did 40 years ago when I was doing a lot of my basic research. And I have been asking myself why this is so. I think it's partly the assumption that in a true society which is not anti-woman, which is not excessively pro-feminist and doesn't make an obsession of feminism, it is really a matter of social justice, as was said earlier. The issue is not only to stop at why women are being subordinated, why are women impoverished, why are women not nurtured properly. The issue is one of going on to understanding how you build a society in which these questions need not be asked, because there is an assumed and automatic equality in that society, where one is not self-consciously saying, I'm a woman, I want to be free, but where the situation is one where, as a woman or a man, whichever you may be, you are automatically free. Now, I agree that this is a struggle. It's a struggle that started in the days when we started working and declaring ourselves to be free women. It is a struggle. It's a struggle that's had some positive effects. It's a struggle that in many areas hasn't happened. As we know today from, for example, not just the fact that rapes are taking place, but the reaction to a woman being raped. It is absolutely horrific, the number of people who say, oh, she had it coming, and who will put the blame on the woman. Now, I think that that kind of thing takes more than the rights of the feminists. It takes really revamping a lot of basic social structures. And it's a question of whether women, whether as feminists or not, are willing to join in the revamping of those social structures. That's a very basic question, I think. But that's a very personal point of view.
No, but I think just as a person of a slightly younger generation than yourself and Romila, I'm Midnight's child. I think what you say, rings true to me also as somebody who's been writing on these issues, that the feminism of the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s was very much rooted in social justice. And I think it had to do with the politics of that time. And I think as we move towards a much more self-centered society and a consumerist society, so did many of these things move into I, me, and myself rather than society as a whole. And I think now we are compelled to move back into that. And in a way, the Hathras horror shows us yet again that it is not just that one woman was raped and murdered, but the fact that nothing has happened in our society as far as the Dalit issue is concerned, that our criminal justice system continues to be broken and not deliver to the poorest and the most marginalized, including women. So these questions have become central again to our discussion on women. So I think therefore, what yourself and Devaki, what you say in your book, I think that location within the politics in which we articulate these views is a very central part of the manner in which then they take on the priorities that they ought to. And I think it's interesting that, in fact, I wanted to ask you that, you have observed, Devaki, you've observed the way feminism in this country has moved. And you've observed it internationally, but also nationally. And what do you feel is the direction it ought to take? I mean, the younger women now who also want freedom, want a right of choice, want equality, and now increasingly are also demanding social justice, and a kind of society where a person, just because they're born into a particular caste or religion, are not automatically excluded. How do you see it progressing in this country?
So, Kalpana, I appreciate your question, but somehow right now, my heart is broken. I don't even feel that we can bring up feminism as a possible flag with which we can heal the terrible situation that is ripping our country apart. I mean, apart from the demolition of the kind of resistance that was put for the CAA and the law that was about to be passed, imagine the enormous uprising that took place to protest against that, the Citizenship Act, and how it has been drowned and actually beaten down. So when you have those sort of crimes being committed, and then of course we talk of rapes which are not reported, but I often feel that rape in UP, there must be 20 times more which are not reported.
Of course.
So there has been no progress really, and I am also searching for what should women's movement, if the pieces of it that still exist, especially young people, what should be doing. I think we have to be political now. We have to have political power. Political power means vote power. And I tried once, and some people did try last election to mobilize women's votes for women, but it has to be men's votes also. There must have be electoral power to redeem justice in this country, both for men, women, Dalits, and so on. It's a very big agenda. I'm saying it's probably unrealistic, but I'm not able to find an answer to what you're saying because the situation has gone completely out of control. I mean, it's difficult to be a citizen of India and not be screaming. So it's a so feminism as a ideology. I like what Romila said. I also define it as standing for justice, not just for women, but justice. I think that's a perfect, crisp, and absolutely appropriate definition. But whether feminist ideology, which actually originally is a political fight, can now carry us to where we want to go, I don't think so. I think it has to be pro-Dalit, pro-Muslim, that kind of a kind of political voice which prevents and aborts the kind of oppression that's taking place in India. But while I talk about India, I'm also so proud that in America, the Black Lives Matter has swept the country's politics and society's consciousness. So if we could do that, it would be such a fantastic thing. But somewhere we have been crippled, I feel. And it's a very depressing thing that I feel like saying that right now the situation in India is not one where I feel that writing a book, being applauded for the book, being, being a star doesn't seem to fit well because the situation is so gloomy and so fearful. So I haven't got.
But Devaki, still, it is nice that you have come out with a book that when you read, one feels, you can smile, and it gives you a great deal. So, congratulations on doing it. So let's come back to the book. I have one more, maybe Romila and Antara have other inputs, but and I'm saying this because a younger generation will also read your book. And I think many of us who have taken a stand, whichever way in our life choices, our parents have been a very important part of it, as women especially. And I think, to me at least, what seemed extraordinary about your family is that despite the orthodoxy which you describe, I mean, you said they accommodated you, but you traveled, you hitchhiked from Germany to England. You did an overland trip in 1962 from London to Delhi, about which sadly there's not enough detail. I wish there had been more. You chose your own path. You were determined to study in Oxford, and you went to Ruskin College and thereafter to St. Anne's. So, and in a way, your parents let you pursue this passion that you had, both for education and for getting out. Um, so how important, and there are so many girls, whether there are girls who pursue a future in sport, for instance, which is still male dominated. All of it comes back somehow in our families and the kind of space they give to our girls when they're growing up. So from your own recounting of it, how important do you feel your family, your parents, the role that they played in your life to become what you are today? And how would you say that that it that orthodoxy is still there? We know it. It hasn't changed in India as far as girls are concerned.
I mean, if my sisters could have answered that question, you would have seen how bitter their answer would have been. Because I was accommodated much more in my attempts to free myself because of the color of my skin.
Oh.
Compared to most of my siblings, I'm lighter. My sisters and many of my brothers were my father's color, a kind of tan brown. So there was a sense that parents felt that, oh, she's fair skinned, she'll find a husband, or boys will like her, because we were all shown to the Brahmin boys. I must have called on the 3 Brahmin boys in Bangalore to be approved to be their wives. And of course, they always said yes because of my skin. And I said no because I was trying to fight away. So I think we forget that there are other issues which create oppression of girls even within the same family. I don't think my parents were particularly liberated, but I think they had a trust that even if I don't get married by the 18 years, which is the kind of normal, some husband will approve of me because of the skin. But happily for me, I never came back for 8 years. I left when I was 22 and I didn't come back till I was 29 by just earning, living and living there. And I'm happy I did that. It was very hard for my mother. But the great advantage at that period, Kalpana, was there was no internet. There was no mobile phone where parents could talk to their children. So for those 5 years, one letter every fortnight, they didn't know where I was, what I was doing. But today, the girls that I meet in Oxford who come from Orthodox families, they're constantly getting phone calls from their mother. Who did you see? What did you eat? So they're absolutely imprisoned. I think there's a change in the world on that. So that's how I was able to cope. I think the color of my skin and the fact that I didn't come back. If I'd come back, I would have got trapped. So I stayed away for about 6-7 years.
So would you
I
agree,
don't know how to answer your question. Your question was so long, I must have forgotten what you asked.
No. I asked about how important, parental attitudes were in terms of women finding the courage and
I think I said
to make
mine
their
was
own choices.
also my color of my skin. And there was a lot of fight with my father. I've written about that, about not getting married to the man he chose.
Yeah.
At the same time, they let go of me because they felt someday some Brahmin boy will say yes because of my skin.
Romila, would you like to add anything to this?
You've done very well with your skin, Devaki. I think actually the struggle does begin in the family. The struggle, because you grow up in a family and you see that your mother is always kept a step lower than your father. Your father is a figure of awe. Your mother is the person whom you sort of talk to perhaps a little more openly, but you do realize that there is a little distance between the two. Now, I don't know whether this is typical of all societies that are undergoing massive change. I mean, if one looks at it as a historian, as I suppose I should look at it, one would explain it by what is happening or happened to the middle class in the last 100 years. And I think in many ways in our families, our parents, I hate to say this, it sounds like the most awful pop psychology, but our parents were partly split personalities, as indeed all the middle class was. What do I mean by being split personalities? It was a new social situation in Indian society. You'd never had a middle class until the 19th century. What do you do with it? How do you behave? How do you construct yourself? What are the ways in which you shape your class? Because this is now a question of you having to decide how you shape yourself. So you pick up the two aspects which you think are important: tradition and liberalism. Tradition goes on telling you, you must behave exactly as your forefathers and ancestors behaved. And here's a body of people who will tell you what your tradition was and will explain to you what your customs are, your rituals are, and so on. And you observe them. So you observe them up to a degree. You either had, like my grandmother or my paternal grandmother, who observed the rituals very closely and was constantly in touch with the local priest who would tell her what she had to do from day to day. Or you had people like my parents who sort of said, well, yes, you are a Hindu, you're a Vaishnav, these are the mythologies, these are the stories, we'll teach you your prayers, and there it ends. That's religion for you. So you had that kind of thing. On the other hand, you had a middle class that was desperately under British Raj, trying to be liberal, trying to cultivate liberal values. Now, if these two things didn't actually confront each other, I don't know what did. And that is why I think you got this situation of patriarchy within the family, as well as young women struggling and saying, no, no, we want to be free, we want to do things on our own, and we're going to do things on our own. Getting away from the family was a major thing. Like Devaki, I went to do an undergraduate degree in London, and I loved London. I was absolutely intoxicated by the fact that I was taking decisions of my own life for myself. I wasn't constantly turning to mother or father or elder sibling and saying, shall I do this? Shall I do this? I had to decide. So I decided, and I loved it. This for me was absolute freedom. I probably made some horrible mistakes, but never mind. It was I who made them, and I was free. Now, that kind of thing, I think, is terribly important, and of course leads to endless questions. Not everybody can do it. And a lot of young women of my age at that time who were as anxious to be free couldn't do it because they didn't get away from their families. They had to live with their families, and they have to finally succumb to pressures of various kinds. So I think that it's these are not absolutes. You, again, if I may say so, I mean, boringly, you come back to your context. And if your context is what it is, you have to first struggle within that context. That is terribly important in order to find out what it is that you're struggling about. And therefore, I think to understand what it is that the family means and what the relationships of the family are is problematic if you're sitting there and saying, I want to get away from all these people and do my own thing. Because getting away and doing your own thing is being totally contrary to the idea of the family, where you were continually interwoven and you were constantly in the arms of your various elders, sometimes even your youngers. And I think that understanding of who am I in terms of all these different contexts, the family, the job, the occupation, the wider society, my social contacts, all of this is terribly important to understanding how we move forward in feminism. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your original question was.
That's okay. We have about five. We have about 5 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions which I think we should take.
I think we should get a view from Antara.
So,
How she thinks about
Antara,
what
do you have something to add to this? Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought that the color of skin might have played a role, certainly, but also I think it's the free spirit that you have. It's if you are as spirited as you are, Devaki, then it's difficult to keep you down in the family also. And also, I think your father allowed both you and your younger sister to ride horses, to ride elephants, to be sportsy, to do a lot of things that in those days women were or girls were not allowed to do. So perhaps it was, as Romila said, this the split personality was at various levels, and also think when we talk about parental influences, I think we undermine the influence of outside forces. It's not just the parents; it's the fact that there are friends of parents, the ideologies that they believe in. That of course, Devaki background is of high society, so you go through the high society parents, then the Gandhian husband. I mean, Elsie Jain influence. I think we have to somehow. I mean, I of course deeply loved him, but apart from that, I think it's there's a lot to say about a very quiet and confident a person like Elsie Jain standing by a free spirit like Devaki Jain to allow her to be the kind of extraordinary feminist that she continued to be even after her marriage. So I think all of these influences, the influence of your feminist friendships, the influence of your Oxbridge education, I think all of it together makes a person. Sorry, Romila, you were saying
Thank you.
something.
Could I put in the two questions, a couple of questions that have come in now before we will have to stop?
I think Romila was about to say something. Sorry.
Romila, were you about to say something?
I was just going to question mark before the word allow.
Allow, okay, yes.
I use the word allow all the time because our circumstances allow us. It's not a thing of control for me anymore. It was at one time. I think it's a generational thing.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question, Devaki, from Barbara Harris White, and I'll read it out to you. She says, many congratulations, Devaki, and the panel. I have a question about books. In the Golden Notebook, Doris Lessing wrote that books that bore you at 20, 30 open doors when you are 40, 50, meaning 40, 50 years old. Well, words to that effect. Are there books that bored you at 40, 50?
Can't hear you properly, Kalpana.
Sorry, okay, I'll read it again.
Yeah. The mouth of your mic here.
Okay, so she says that in the Golden Notebook, Doris Lessing wrote that books that bore you when you were 20 or 30 years old open doors for you when you're 40 or 50 years old. Well, words to that effect, she says. So are there books that bored you when you were 40 or 50 years old that open doors for you now?
It's a difficult question to answer, Barbara, because when I was, say, 12, 13, 14, I had a brother who gave me the most wonderful books. He gave me Antoine Saint-Exupéry. He gave me all those Little Prince and other books which were coming out at that time. And then as I grew up, I chose my own books. So I cannot say that there was a book influence, but I think society was a very important thing. Politics and society, I think, influenced me more than books. Um, I know that I refer to Doris Lessing because I was absolutely charmed by her Golden Notebook and the previous books that she had written. that idea of speaking about self in such a sense where, in a way, Iris also does that. Murdoch, in a different way, her novels, though they may not be about her, have that kind of conversation between people. And I love that idea of conversation between people, which in a way brings their truth out. And this fascinated me even in some of Iris Murdoch's book. But Doris faced that. So I cannot say that I am doing a golden notebook, but I can definitely say that I did a brass notebook in the sense that I did try to write my life in pieces without necessarily trying to say I was doing that at 13, I did that 30, that kind of chronology, but
Maybe
more
you
in
can
terms of
maybe you
events.
can explain why you called it the brass notebook. I think that's another question that is asked: is why have you called your book the brass notebook?
As I've said in my foreword and my introduction, I was fascinated by Doris Lessing. I spent 3 hours with her, and she told me how she framed 4 notebooks. What was the first, how she did the second. It was a very interesting exposition of which parts of your life are focused on as you grew up. And then the fact that she wanted to wrap it up, looking back, and called the last book Golden Notebook, that fascinated me. So then I thought, I cannot aspire to write what she has written, but I will write it, I call it a lower metal, brass, which I said is the metal that we use in our families. Now, firstly, I lowered myself from Doris Lessing. Secondly, in a way, if you look at the chapters in the book, it's not like a trajectory of time and age. It's events, experiences, and so it's more like a notebook than a kind of a storyline. So I thought I'd call it a brass book and try to imitate that idea of chopping up events into bits like Oxford, marriage, love, like that. So you don't see many of the biographies I've read. Say I went to college and I did that, I did that, I did that. I imitated Doris in the silly sense that I can't imitate her, but I broke it up into different kind of laddus.
Okay. So there's one more question, Devaki, from MD Riti from Bangalore. She
From who?
says,
MD.
MD Riti. She says, Devaki, how would you like posterity to remember you?
How would you like what to remember you?
Posterity.
Austerity.
Posterity. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's a very difficult question. Probably nobody will remember me.
No.
I mean, in the 3 of us that you've got here, Romila will be remembered. Her books will never die. But what have I achieved or done which will make me rememberable? I'm not rememberable. I didn't build a monument or be the first to break the Ayodhya temple. But so I'm not going to be remembered. I would have liked to be a MP, member of parliament, and do something fantastic so that I'm remembered always, and a road is named after me or a square is named after me. But the life I've led doesn't have that. But I
Yes.
definitely think Ramila will be remembered for centuries for the kind of foundations she's done in history. Don't you agree? No, you won't agree. How could you agree?
I would agree because I think it's much more likely that you will be remembered for the brass notebook.
Pardon?
You will be remembered for the brass notebook because many people will relate to it.
Really? I
I,
hope so.
So, on that happy note, on which I will say both Romila and Devaki will definitely be remembered. We'll come to a close for this wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, Devaki, for writing the book and for giving us a chance to have this conversation. Romila, thank you very much for all you said. As usual, it's inspiring and wonderful to hear you. And Antara, for being part of this conversation too. I want to say a special thanks to, of course, IIC and to Speaking Tiger for publishing this book and giving us all a chance to spend this afternoon
But
together.
I want to thank you, Kalpana. You carried us over this so beautifully. I had no idea how you do it. But I think the real applause should be to you. You just helped us all to articulate without that. So claps to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Over to you, IIC.
Yeah, you did that right. Thank you.